In this video, I'm going to show how to draw complex textures and patterns in graphite. Now to start with, I'm going to begin as always with the eyes, but of course with a snail their eye shape is completely different. Now the one thing that I want to really be focusing on here is not to over-exaggerate the eyes, it's more about the soft transparency and therefore those lighter values that creates that shape and form. This is a great example of where we don't want to be forcing what we know is there because it's just not visible in the reference photo. Now onto the first complex pattern of this and the snail's body. Now for this section I had two approaches. The first is where I've now applied a layer of graphite powder just so that I'm not fighting with the white of the paper. And then I'm now using my HB pencil and actually drawing in the round and oval shapes of those patterns that I can see. Now I actually found the more that I used this approach, I was making it more complex than it needed to be. So I then switched to a different method of using a very dark layer of graphite that I built up in stages, which I will be showing in a moment, and then using my erasers on top of that to pull in these highlights and create the pattern that way. I definitely found by having more of a bold, darker layer and then building in this pattern simplified this drawing process significantly. Now this is a wonderful thing about drawing any textures for the first time. It's going to encourage us to use different techniques, and then we have to think about whether or not we can simplify that but still get to the end result. Now these small drawings, this is only a 4x6. This is perfect for this kind of approach. The experimentation here is what's going to help to improve our drawing skills for future projects. Now the other reason I decided to draw this on a smaller scale is because these size drawings are perfect for fitting in during larger, more complex pieces, or if you are feeling particularly burnt out. That feeling of wanting to be at the easel but maybe not knowing where to start, maybe there is specific stresses that are making that drawing process more difficult, then these smaller pieces are perfect for that. They really do help to keep that routine nice and varied, and I do think that plays a big part in always keeping that motivation and that desire to create. Now onto the rest of the body, and this is where I'm going to use that slightly different approach. So I'm first of all mapping in those main lights and darks. Now when using graphite powder, it's never the aim to get it as dark as what the pencil layers will achieve. This is purely just to map that in so that again we're not working with the white of the paper. Now starting off here, I am just mapping in the main darker areas, and you'll see that in a moment I'll come back in with my erasers. Now the way that we work through a drawing, it's a great example that there are many different ways to get to the same end. The top section of this drawing is fine, it took a little bit longer, but it's more than acceptable to work in that way if that's what you find easier. Now at this stage, using the battery eraser, you can see that I'm able to then map in more of the shapes and the patterns without having to spend the time to actually draw them. So I'm allowing the battery eraser to do more of the work for me. Now depending on how the graphite is applied, the erasers are going to work in a different way. One of the common questions that I'm asked is how to get a Tombow mono eraser, which I will be using when we draw the shell, is how to get that eraser to create those fine lines and actually remove that layer of graphite. Now I've found that if the graphite is applied incorrectly, so for example here, on this section, if I had jumped into my darkest, softest pencils like a 9B first, and I hadn't built up my stages of graphite gradually, that those erasers are going to have a much harder time to remove that graphite off the paper. So one of those key aspects of getting any eraser to be the best that it can, I find that the layering process with the graphite is crucial. Now another reason that I like to build up my graphite in stages is because it reduces that graphite shine. Now graphite shine isn't something that personally bothers me, but if it is something that you want to limit or avoid in your work, then building up those layers more in stages is one of those ways to do so. Now the nature of graphite, there is going to be a degree of shine, it can't be prevented completely, but the layering process is a big part of that. Now, one other aspect that is crucial in any drawing is the light source. Now, where there is a strong shadow, we want to be making sure that we are allowing that to be visible, the same with a highlight. Now, one of my biggest tips is we don't want to be adding shadows and highlights where they shouldn't be based on our reference photo. So here the darkest part on the body is the midsection of the snail. There's that highlight on the top of the head, and then obviously it's a little bit lighter at the bottom of the body. Now there are a couple of reasons for that. In this situation, it could be that the light had bounced off of the ground and then reflected up onto the wetter surface of the skin at the base of the body, and that creates that lighter highlight. At the top of the head, of course, we've got the light that comes down from the sky that would automatically make the top of the head there appear lighter. Now these two factors will vary depending on the light source, whether or not there are any objects that are surrounding the animal that we're drawing. But noticing the main direction of that light source can really help add more shape and form to the drawing. Now in all of my projects, no matter the medium that I'm working in, I always focus on good contrast. Good contrast is what's going to make our drawing look realistic. Graphite is a wonderful example of that because there is no part of this that is colour based. It's the values, the importance of those highlights and shadows that are giving that realistic appearance to the animals that we're drawing. Now as I start to build up the values on the shell here, everything in terms of the supplies I'm using are the same. I start off with a layer of graphite powder, hinting at those main lights and darks, but I'm also hinting at the way that the shell is curved. This is a big part of drawing any structure like this, and as you can see when I'm continuing with my graphite pencils, I'm always reinforcing that. Now one thing that is really important when drawing anything that is wet or shiny is it needs to have good contrast in order to look realistic. Now if I'd have left the shell as this being my darkest value, you can see here that it looks quite flat. But as I continue to build up my darker layers, this is where I'm starting to create more shape and form. Now I'm deliberately not adding my darker pencils over the areas where I know there's going to be a brighter highlight. That's going to make it easier for the erasers to pull in those highlights, and I'm also indicating at where I want the shine to be even at these earlier stages. Now as I continue to build up these darker values, I'm now in that moment where I'm going to consider to start using my erasers. Now I personally like to use my erasers throughout various times in that layering process rather than just using them at those end stages. Now there are many times where I'll use an eraser and I'll pull in a highlight that is going to inevitably be too bright. I can then tone that down with more graphite and turn it into a mid-tone. I can then come back in with my erasers and create more highlights. This is a wonderful way of enhancing the mid-tones, which does really help with the level of softness. Now, although I want this shell to be shiny, there is still a lot of softness to it. You can see how many of the mid-tones I've been building up here. It's not just about getting my darker values really dark and leaving the white of the paper for my brightest highlights. Despite the highlights that I'm going to be adding here, I've still used layers of graphite in place first. Now there are many times where I might allow the white of the paper to show through right from the very beginning, such as a really bright highlight in the eye. But for a surface like this and on the body, I certainly found it easier to have a layer of graphite, even if it is just graphite powder, in place first and then use my erasers over the top. The other thing that's really important with this and why I chose this approach for the shell and the body is none of these highlights are truly white. If I was to create a tonal swatch of the reference photo and put a white colour up against it, only if the image was overexposed would it actually be bright white. In many situations, unless the highlight in the eye, as I've mentioned, is significantly brighter, the rest of the values usually are going to have even just a slight bit of a grey tint to it. So that tells me that I need to have some level of graphite over all areas and then pull my erasers over the top for those brighter details. But I can't stress enough, if there is an area of the drawing that you want to have bright white, then leaving the white of the paper there is really effective. Now one other thing to consider with that is, let's say you have allowed the white of the paper for a bright highlight or the reflection in an eye, and you still feel like it needs to be lighter, but you can't physically get it bright enough because it is the white of the paper. If that was to happen, then that is an indication that what's next to it isn't dark enough. So for example, the shine on the shell. If that looked really dull, but I know I physically can't get it any brighter, then I know that I need to darken up the shadows around it, which will automatically help with that highlight. Now at this stage it would be very easy to call this finished, but coming back in with my battery eraser I can be a little bit more precise and adding in some more of the textured little dots for those highlights. This helps just to give it a little bit more of a worn look and it doesn't look as artificial. Now my personal preference with little projects like this, or if I was to work with a full body portrait of a dog for example, is to have some degree of shadow underneath the animal. I feel that this helps to make it look more grounded. It doesn't make the animal look like it's floating in midair. And for this I just simply did use again my graphite powder and then reinforce that slightly with my graphite pencils. And I always want to make sure that that shadow is in the right place following that light source. It's really important, otherwise it makes the shadow look like it's not part of the actual drawing and the animal won't look like it's on the ground in this situation. So that is something that I do really want to focus on. Now all of my real-time tutorials are recorded with a voiceover while I'm drawing, so everything is explained thoroughly in the moment. It makes even the most complex patterns such as this far easier to tackle. If any of my step-by-step lessons are of interest, or you would like to draw along to the real-time version of this tutorial, then I'll link all of the information to that in the description below. So I do hope this video has been helpful. If it was, I'd be very grateful if you could give it a like and a thumbs up. It makes a huge difference to my channel. I also upload a couple of videos to YouTube every week, so if you would like to get notified of that content, then don't forget to hit the subscribe and the bell button. If you do have any art related questions, feel free to pop them in the comments. I'm more than happy to help if I can. And I'm going to be uploading another video at the end of the week, but as always, thank you so much for watching.